is there a clue inside of this data? Is there something in the background of one of these videos, one of these images that might indicate where she is in the world, right? There's something. And so they started looking at it, and lo and behold, in the background of one of the videos was a soda cup, like a restaurant soda cup, fast food. And fortunately, it wasn't McDonald's, it wasn't Burger King, it wasn't anything like that. It was a regional fast food chain that was based out of Portland, Oregon, and called Burgerville. And, you know, basically, really, people only from the Northwest would know Burgerville.
All right, Jim. Jim, you were a detective?
I was in law enforcement and government for about 36 years, and started as an Army counterintelligence special agent, then a detective with a tribal police department, and then a federal special agent with Homeland Security investigations.
Oh, wow, so all kinds of different interesting facets to your career. Tell me about how you got into law enforcement.
Yeah, it wasn't really planned. I wanted to be a computer programmer or a journalist. And that's kind of where I'd focused in high school. I ended up going in the Army, and I didn't have a ton of college options and those kind of things, so I ended up going in the Army and enlisting. But I went to the recruiter and said, hey, I want to do computer programming. Wasn't really a thing in the Army at the time. It was all brand new, and so they didn't really have a job field for that. So the recruiter showed me a Laserdisc with an MOS, a military occupational specialty called Record Telecommunications Center Operator. But it was using computers, using these big Star Trek looking computers and blinking lights and big magnetic tape reels. And so I was like, yeah, that's it. Because my father had been drafted in Vietnam. And anybody got drafted pretty much, like if you were a younger male, you're going to be infantry. So he was an infantryman. And when I talked about going to the military, he said, he gave me a pretty sage piece of advice. He said, if you're going to go in the military, do not go in the infantry. Get a job that translates to a civilian job so that you learn a skill set that you can come out with and be successful. And very good advice, because when you're 18 years old, the infantry or the special forces, like that's very alluring, especially the movies and all those kind of things. And so, but I was very interested in technology and computers, so that's kind of where it landed me. So I go off to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where I do basic training, and I love it. It's like the pay wasn't great. They're paying me to, play soldier, to play in the woods, and so it was great and different from my daily life. And so I enjoyed that, and then on to advanced individual training at Fort Gordon, Georgia, where I learned the record telecommunications piece, and it was a job that required a top secret SCI security clearance. And so I have a squeaky clean background, so that goes through no problem. Learn how to deal with classified material and all that stuff, which you see in the movies and kind of stuff. And went on from there, and my first duty assignment was Korea. So I'm 18, 19 years old, and I find myself on this big, massive charter plane just full of people, all in the military on their way to Korea. And in the late 80s, early 90s, till kind of the height of the Cold War. And so get to Korea and process through what they call a reception battalion, and I end up on this little base called Camp Colburn. And it's where the 304th Signal Battalion was. I end up in the telecommunications section. And our job was to basically take this this military trailer kind of thing that folded out. We deployed it. It was on these wheels with generators, and we pull it out to the field, and we'd open it all up and set it all up, and it was a telecommunications center with all the equipment and everything you needed. And so then I didn't know it, and now I know, I have ADD-HD.
Software Underbelly is about giving people a space to tell their stories, even when these stories challenge what we think we know. Ground News shows us different perspectives in the media, which is why Ground News is a perfect sponsor for my channel. In a world where algorithms censor much of the information we receive, some of the most important stories get missed from our news feeds. Ground News highlights local news from around the world, giving you an on-the-ground perspective that national coverage might miss. The app and website empowers you to form your own opinions by presenting you with every article published on any news story worldwide. My favorite part of the app is the data it gives you on each news source as you read it, such as where it leans on the political spectrum, a factuality rating indicating how subjective their printed reporting tends to be, and who funds it. I particularly like their blind spot feed, dedicated to showing you news stories that are underrepresented in the mainstream media. You can check this all out by scanning the QR code on screen or clicking the link below. It's easy to forget how much bias can shape the reality we live in. And in a world where our attention is constantly being fought over, my Vantage plan easily helps me keep up with more important stories slipping through the cracks. So I encourage you to check them out at ground.news/SWU. Subscribe through my link or download the mobile app and enter promo code SWU to save 40% off their Vantage plan. And by subscribing or even gifting it to someone you know, you're helping hold the media accountable and helping my channel directly. Thank you for watching.
And it's a blessing and a curse, right? It's one of those things that is really weird because it causes you not to be able to focus. It's things drive your attention very quickly, but it also allows you to hyper focus on anything that you're super interested in. And so I was one of those folks, like I was going to learn everything there was to know about my job. I was going to be the best, record telecommunications specialist the Army ever saw. And so I just learned that system inside and out and really knew everything about it. And my section chief gave me the nickname Dictionary. And he wouldn't call me Cole. He'd just say Dictionary. What about this or what about that? And so I kind of figured out there that like I had an ability to really absorb certain types of information, but then be completely distracted about other things. And while there, I ended up meeting my first wife, and she was my team leader in the thing, which is not allowed, if anybody's guessing. And so we end up in a relationship, and we get caught. In the barracks, they did what's called a health and welfare inspection. And there was a point in time where I was basically living in her room. We were in co-ed barracks, and I was living in her room while her two roommates were on a training deployment. And one morning I came out. I'd leave like 4 o'clock in the morning to go back to my room so nobody would notice. And I come out, and there's an NCO at the end of the hall, and he's like, "Go back in your room." I was like, so I tried to be sneaky and meander down to my room. He said, "I said go back in your room." I said, "That's not my room." He's like, "Well, then go back in the room you came out of." And a couple hours later, the commander and everybody came around, and we were busted. And another kind of life lesson, my father instilled really strong integrity and ethics in me already, even though this would seem counter to that since we were sneaking around. But we get down there, and they caught five couples. And we were the second to last one to go in. And there was one guy out there, and he's like, "Tell him you're going to tell him that you came over for toothpaste, and you're there to watch a movie and you fell asleep." And he's giving everybody like a cover story. And I'm thinking to myself, they're not idiots. Like this is like, we're just going to go in and.
Sounds like it happens a lot.
Yeah, I mean, we're just going to go in and say this. And there's a saying in law enforcement that the cover-up can be worse than the crime. Mm-hmm. And so we went in, her and I remember the first sergeant saying, "So, what were you guys doing?" Expecting some story. And I said, do I need to explain it? And he was like, so you don't have like, you weren't there for toothpaste? I was like, no, I spent the night in a room. And he's like, okay, good. So they kind of did that. And then we got the least, they basically came in and said, since you told the truth, we're going to give you half the punishment we're giving everybody else. And which was a good, telling the truth, had a positive consequence in a situation. And so we ended up 7 days restriction to base, 7 days extra duty. And that extra duty was raking leaves. It was fall, and we raked leaves, more leaves than I ever want to see in my life, piles and piles of leaves. And it was kind of interesting, some of these weird things that kind of drive lessons into you, right? So from there, she gets pregnant. She ends up getting out of the military. I had arrived there several months before she did. So she wasn't scheduled to leave for like 4 months. I was getting to my new duty assignment, which was the Presidio of San Francisco, right here in California. And so she decided to get out, and I go back home. I remember my parents picked me up at the Syracuse airport, and I loaded after the hugs and everything, I loaded everything in the car, and I'm in the back seat. And I said, so, getting married. And I remember my parents, it was a stunned silence. Here I am, I'm 19 years old. And I said, and she's pregnant. It's like a double whammy, right, for my parents. And they really took it very well. And next thing you know, they're working to get her to my hometown in New York and plan a wedding. So we have a wedding, and up at Presidio San Francisco, and working in the comm center out there. And my first daughter's born there, and then my second daughter would also be born in San Francisco. But while working there, the Army Counterintelligence Office there in the Presidio was working a pretty significant investigation involving a U.S. soldier that was providing information to a foreign government. And the way that they would report on that is they'd write it up on a form that we would then transmit for them and receive to go back to the headquarters. And so me and my buddy Leslie, we're reading these reports every day, going out, and it reads like a spy novel. They're doing surveillance and doing all these things, and so I said, man, I want to do that. I don't want to just read about it. And that was really the first inkling of looking at all that long story to first inkling to look at law enforcement as and that's kind of a very niche piece of law enforcement. So I end up asking one of the agents or one of the people that came to pick up message traffic one day, how did you get your job? They were always in civilian clothes when they came over. And he said, oh, actually, we go through these cycles of recruiting. He's like, call this guy at this phone number. So I do. Go through this interview process, and they give you a whole packet to go out and accomplish. And again, this laser focus, right, serves me well, because now this is what I'm about. I'm about getting that job. It means that other things suffer, but this is what I'm about. And so I complete the packet, and I call the guy up and say, hey, I completed the packet. It was a week, and he said, there's no way. He's like, you get one shot. You come here and it's not complete, then you're walking out the door and you're not coming back. And he said, so you need to make sure it's complete and then call me. And so I was like, wow. So I went through the packet. I actually had another guy go through the packet for me. He's like, yeah, it's done. So I called the guy back up and I said, it's done. He's like, you're sure? Yep, I'm done. All right, show up this building this time. So I go over there. And it's like a day long writing essays and interviews and current events and all kinds of stuff. And at the end of it, you don't really know how you've done. It's just, he's like, look, I'll put the packet together and I'll send this up to Department of Army Military Intelligence, Counterintelligence Command. and you'll get a letter, your command, you don't even get the letter. Your commander will get a letter one way or the other. I'm like, well, how long does that take? He's like, anywhere from 2 to 6 months. Like, okay. So I go back to doing my job. One day my commander calls me up. It's probably three months or so. He calls me up and he says, congratulations. You've been accepted to be an Army counterintelligence agent, and now you're waiting on orders to go to Fort Huachuca, Arizona, for I think 18 weeks of what we call CI basic school. End up going there, went through that. I loved it, loved every minute of it. Surveillance and counter surveillance and just tradecraft and national security law and all these different things. And I loved every minute of it. Interviewing, and then my first post was Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, 125th Military Intelligence Battalion, 25th Infantry Division, and it was a really unique assignment because we spent kind of half of our time being strategic, like investigating national security crimes occurring within the base, and then the other half of the time supporting what we call the warfighter, which is supporting the 25th Infantry Division combat brigades as they're deploying or for exercises or real-world events. And so we would travel all over the Pacific Rim for that, so just lots of travel. And some of my best friends, like some of my closest relationships, came from that assignment to this day. And it's funny because people went to different realms. Some went into law enforcement, and I'm probably closer with them. And one of them, one of my really good buddies, actually became to be the director of Army counterintelligence at the highest level at the end of his career. That's where he retired out of. And but like one of my good buddies is the sheriff of Brown County up in Green Bay, and then so I go from Hawaii to Fort Lewis, Washington, and then doing kind of similar things there. And then I decided to get out of the Army at about 8 years. And my wife at the time is a Native American. So my kids are about half. And I looked at like where she lived in her hometown, so I applied to be a detective with the tribal police department, not knowing really what that meant. I didn't really know. And she kind of warned me. She did. But we end up there, and I don't end up getting picked up as a detective because at the time they didn't hire. Really, the detective hirings were kind of internal, and you needed to be 3 years on the department before you were eligible. So I ended up being a patrol officer, and it's where I learned how to be a cop. And so here I am, I'm a white cop on a Native American reservation, and I really learned how to communicate. You have to. It's 1,000 square miles, and it can be very violent. There's a lot going on there. It's a small population. It's about, at the time I was there, it was between 3,500 and 3,700 people. But if you think about like what a police department looks like in a city or village of 3,500 people, generally speaking, at that size, you're looking at one cop per 1,000 people. So that would equate to roughly 3.5 cops. And we had 35 patrol officers. We had 7 detectives. We had 10 fish and game officers. It fluctuated. We had community-oriented policing officers, and then, of course, all the admin. Then we had our own jail with correctional staff. And so to give you any indication of and we were busy. We were all very busy. And I learned, even more than in the military, how to deal with critical incidents and life and death situations, and guns being pointed at me and me pointing guns at people and arresting people, and human suffering, and all the things that go with it, and hopelessness that can sit inside of certain communities, and drug like seeing the ravages of drug addiction and alcohol addiction, and seeing violence. And so I really learned very quickly, and I remember, and being here in LA right now, the Rodney King beating had happened roughly this time, and I remember saying to myself that I'm always going to conduct myself as if there is a video camera following me around, even though at this time body-worn cameras weren't. I mean, they weren't around. But I remember saying to myself, I watched different things and we were taught at the academy about how adrenaline and tunnel vision and emotion can really start to take over, and maybe people who wouldn't do things normally will, or maybe people prone to violence will be more violent. And so I just remember saying to myself, I'm always going to treat people with dignity and respect, and I'm always going to conduct myself as if everything I do would be on camera for the world to see. And that served me very well, because I was definitely, we got in a lot of pursuits and a lot of those types of engagements. And I became, when I first got there, man, I was called crazy names, things it really mind boggled me. I mean, I was called a white N-word, and I was like, I had never heard. I was like trying to put this into context for my own brain space, but and several other different things. But over time, my reputation became known as somebody that would be strict but fair, and would always just treat people with respect. And so that served me very well too, because I could show up at a scene and maybe someone who wasn't being compliant would see that I was there, and it would really diffuse the situation, because they knew that I wasn't gonna treat them the wrong way. And I had people an officer would be there and trying to arrest them, and they would be non-compliant, and I would show up, and they'd be like, "Oh, I'll let him put handcuffs on me," and they would just turn around and put their hands behind their back. And so I went through about a year and a half on patrol, and then detectives came to me and said, "Hey, we're going to have a position open, and we just noticed that your reports are different, and some of the things you take certain things further." And that was just because of my training and experience as an Army counterintelligence agent. And so I went over to detectives, started in general crime, saw child abuse cases. It was really where the first time I saw like child abuse as a criminal issue, and also the humanity or lack of humanity behind that, and worked those cases. But I wouldn't say that I understood it well. I didn't understand a lot about it. Worked, and then I went to narcotics, and I worked narcotics cases for roughly 3 years or so on a regional drug task force. During this time, I'm also on the regional SWAT team. And then I go over to major violent crimes, which included a major crimes team across the Central Oregon area. And just got exposed to a lot of different crime types. I mean, one of the folks that you interviewed was talking about, like, not every, like there are true victims who are really innocent, and then there are people who put themselves in positions and maybe end up severely hurt or dead. And I saw all of that, I saw both of those scenarios. And the kid cases are definitely the toughest, right? Because kids really truly are innocent. And it's the child murders and the child severe physical assaults that are probably the hardest to deal with, and the victim and the suspect's not always who you think it is. It kind of in mainstream society has had mothers who, one who beat her child to death, and you want to automatically assume it's like the stepdad, because there was a stepdad in that situation, because statistics would show, but in this particular case, it was absolutely the mom. And had a case where a woman had locked her 4-year-old toddler in a car when it was 100 degrees outside, and he expired in the car due to severe heat, stroke, and dehydration. And the woman who did that was the wife of one of our police officers. It's a really, really hard and difficult case to deal with. But at the end of the day, she went to prison. He was pretty tore up about it as he lost a son and he lost his wife. And his whole family unit really just kind of eroded around him. But so do all this time, I'm what we call an FBI TFO, it's a task force officer. So I have federal authority, just like the FBI. I'm working with the FBI office out of Bend. And one of the FBI agents that I work with was really pushing me to go federal. And then 9/11 happened. And because it was really difficult to get hired by a federal agency, they get 30, 40,000 applicants for very few positions, so it was extremely competitive. And the other piece of that is, I didn't have a college degree. And so certain agencies required a 4-year degree. Others did not, but it was really hard to get hired without a college degree because it's just one of those things, in the list of things about being competitive. And but then 9/11 happened, and it kind of opened things up. The agencies started hiring. And so I applied for what was the U.S. Customs Service at the time, to be a special agent with the U.S. Customs Service. Later would be part of the Homeland Security legislation that would create the Department of Homeland Security and rename it and move some things around, but and would later become Homeland Security Investigations. And I get to the office up there. I get hired in Portland, Oregon, and I get to the office, and I didn't really know the supervisors there. And I'd gone to the academy and come back, and I met them, but I'm like, again, I would be like one of the first people in the office, and so I'm there early, and my boss was there early as well, trying to do a memo, right? Just a simple memo up to headquarters, and they just changed to Microsoft Word, and he couldn't get the format right. And I hear him down the hall. He's like, "God damn, fuck, all this," and I'm like, "All right, what's going on?" So I kind of peek around the door, and he's like, "I can't get this thing, And I said, "Well, let me take a look." So I sit down and help him format the document, and it stick. He turns to me and says, "Oh, you're a technology guy." I said, "Well, yeah, I like technology. I don't think formatting a Word document is the litmus test for that, but yeah, I'm a technology guy." And he's like, all this, at the time, the vernacular surrounding the crime type of what we now call child exploitation was often referred to as child pornography, which is a term we don't like to use anymore. And he said, all this CP stuff is going online. It's on the internet now. Because remember, this is the early 2000s, and where the internet really got into home spaces in like 1999-ish, 2000-ish. And so he's like, I need somebody that can kind of, go into that digital age and do these cases, because the guy who's doing it now is, he's going to retire. And so I'm like, okay. Well, he then tells that guy. That guy takes me down to an office, to this review room, and he puts on a screen. And I noticed he turns up the speakers, and it's like, all right, and he puts on a child sexual abuse material video, and I had never seen anything like it. I mean, I've stood over. If you can die away, I've probably seen it. I've seen decomposed bodies that, we discovered that I've been into homes where flies are thick on the windows because of death in the home, or animals have and I remember sitting there and I remember saying in my brain I'm not going to show any emotion, but inside everything in the fiber of my being was like, I don't think I can be shocked. And this was shocking. And the audio made it that much worse. And he knew he put on some of the worst because he wanted to see, here's Dale telling Ben that I'm going to be the new Ben as he goes. And Ben's like, well, can this guy handle it? Does he curl up in the fetal position on the floor? And I don't. And then Ben plays another one. And I'm just like, okay, I think I get it. Like, all right, so this is like what you're dealing with. He's like, it's this every day. Like this is what we do every day. It's now that the internet is here and people can, one, communicate and find like-minded people, and in the digital age, send a picture over the wire in a matter of seconds and feel like they're anonymous, it has exploded. And you think about this area, like before the internet, if you were sexually interested in a child, then how did you find other people like you? You knock on the neighbor's door and be like, hey, I'm into kids, are you? Like, it's not a conversation you can even have. So, you don't run into somebody at the grocery store and figure that out. You don't. So now that we had the internet and you could basically go anonymously onto, a forum or in an email group or a talk group and find people that are like-minded, it meant that this crime type just exploded, because not only do you find someone that is like-minded to just say, hey, I'm out here too, you're not alone, like we're yeah, I think the same way or have the same attractions or whatever, but now you can be like, well, hey, I have these pictures, or I can create these pictures, and now you've got a bit of a this ecosystem that develops, right? And so, this crime of child exploitation, child sexual abuse material just absolutely exploded. And I'm learning how to do these cases. We're getting these things called cyber tips from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. We're getting leads from other offices. We're investigating these folks. And I had been taught to do it in such a way that was pretty, what we would call offender focused. So, because that's what everybody was doing at the time. That's globally. And that was basically, we would get a lead, we would investigate that lead to get to a residence, right? So the lead would come in, let's say from, a social media platform like Facebook. And they'd say, hey, we detected that, someone sent an illegal image to another person. And so we're either the sender or the receiver, but we're one of those, and we're going to investigate that. And usually it was never one file, it was usually multiple. And so we're looking at, well, who's that user, where do they live, what's in the residence, who's there, and then that's all going to lead to a search warrant at that residence. And so I'm learning how to do this, and we would go in and we would, do the search warrant. We'd be looking for digital devices. It would allow us to seize phones, tablets, computers, hard drives, thumb drives, discs, floppy drives discs at the time, and anything that could hold that type of digital data we could seize as part of the warrant. And then we'd go back and we would image it all or create a copy of it all, and then review that copy, run it through software, and look at all the images and stuff that was on there. And then we would go and indict that person for the federal crime, usually of what we would call the distribution of the receipt or distribution or possession of child pornography as per the U.S. statute. And in doing that, we're using techniques that help us find like, oh yeah, the person has this large amount of files, but what we're not doing is looking for new victims in that ocean of data. And because most people, I think, thought, well, that's happening somewhere else. My guy is just a trader. We weren't looking at it as far as like maybe they're abusing a child and manufacturing or producing this material. And so one of the most prolific cases on the planet at the time ends up coming into our office. And I'm not going to say the name of the case, but I'm just going to call it the V case. And anybody in our world would know what I'm talking about. It's that prolific. And so the V case came in the door, and it was the first time that instead of just like looking for someone who possessed something or distributed it or received it, we were actually looking for the child that was depicted in the material who was being abused. And it was novel to me. Like that had never happened before, and it was like a light bulb went off in my brain about that. And these two great investigators in Toronto, Canada, at the Toronto Police Service, Bill McGarry and Warren Bulmer, they were seizing this series, as were we, but one of them says to the other, and there's a little bit of conflict of who said to who first, but one of them said to the other, is anyone looking for her? And they kind of looked at each other and said, why not us? And so they started doing a whole bunch of things that were pretty innovative at the time to try to figure out, well, is there a clue inside of this data? Is there something in the background of one of these videos, one of these images that might indicate where she is in the world, right? There's something. And so they started looking at it, and lo and behold, in the background of one of the videos was a soda cup, like a restaurant soda cup, fast food. And fortunately, it wasn't McDonald's, it wasn't Burger King, it wasn't anything like that. It was a regional fast food chain that was based out of Portland, Oregon, and called Burgerville. And, basically, really, people only from the Northwest would know Burgerville. And they figured out, it was difficult. The video was grainy, like they had to put a lot of effort. It took them a couple of weeks to figure out that that's what this was. And so that's why the lead comes in to us in Portland, Oregon, because they're like, when we looked at this restaurant, there were only 59 locations, and all of them were within 50 miles of downtown Portland, Oregon. And so that's a pretty good clue that at least that video was taken in the area. And so that comes into us and the Oregon Internet Crimes Against Children team, which we were heavily partnered with. And so we start doing a bunch of novel things, because that novel approach coming into us almost was like a light switch going off to allow us to think more outside the box and more innovative. And we did a whole bunch of things. Her face was depicted, so we went to schools and pulled yearbooks of the appropriate age, thinking, okay, maybe she lives in this area. So we're going through yearbooks looking for any child that looks like her. And we found several that kind of looked like her, but then turned out not to be her. And we went to, there's one video where she's speaking, but the audio is so low you can't hear it, you can just see it. So we went to Oregon School of the Deaf, and we asked if they could lip read, and if there was any clue in anything she said. Maybe she said a name, maybe whatever. And so we were doing things like that, and trying to find her. And my buddy and partner and lifelong friend, Josh Finley, was the primary case agent. I was the case agent, like the technical lead on that, along with the Oregon ICAC. And so we spent a year and a half trying to find her. Now, I tell people, a lot of times civilians think, a year and a half, like cops only get one case, and you're assigned this case, and that's all you do. It's not the way it works. Generally speaking, we're going to be running anywhere from 15 to 40 cases all at the same time, and we got things to do, and some will move fast and some will move slow. And so you're kind of, but in the meantime, in this year and a half, we're doing something on this case very routinely and trying to find her. And then one day I'm at a conference in Washington, D.C. with a dear friend from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and one of the founders of their child victim identification program. She gets a phone call from Warren Bulmer and says, "Hey, congratulations on finding V." And I'm like, and she's like, "Jim, did you find her?" And I'm like, I mean, unless something happened in the last 24 hours, I don't know. I don't know what he's talking about. And he, talking to him later, he was actually mad. He was calling us and saying, "Hey, congratulations," was kind of like, well, hey, you bastards, you didn't even call me to tell me. You found her, and I'm the one who, we sent it, you don't even tell me. And but we had no idea what he was talking about. So went up and got on a laptop, and what he said was, "Yeah, she was on America's Most Wanted." I was like, "What?" And so pull up the laptop and go to America's Most Wanted and look at the page, and sure as shit, there she is. And they didn't obfuscate her in any way. She was 17 now. They didn't hide her voice. They didn't realize the ramifications that would have. But so here she is. And so not only do we as police put the puzzle pieces together, but now so do the bad guys, right? All the offenders who've seen the videos now can make the connection and know exactly who her is, her real name, her location. There's so much information about her. And the offender in this case is her biological father. So she's got the same last name, so all these things, right? And now he's on the run. He's a fugitive. And what had happened is she she had actually stopped the abuse. So the videos got released. We don't know. So the videos end up getting released out into the public, like on the different sites that these guys are training, probably 4 or 5 years after they were actually created. And so she's 4 or 5 years younger at the time. Well, then, in the meantime, everything's happening, or maybe even, I guess it has to be even longer than that. But in the meantime, she's growing up, she's becoming a teenager, and she actually stopped the abuse herself. She eventually tells her dad, "I'm not doing I don't want to do this anymore." And he makes an agreement with her that if she doesn't okay, I'll stop. I'll never touch you again. Just you keep the secret, you don't tell. That was the agreement, and she agreed to it. And so she had not told a soul for a long time. And she stopped the abuse when she was about 12 to 13. So now so it was about 5 years or so. So now she's 17 and she's on America's Most Wanted because she's watching the movie Forrest Gump with her mom. Mom and dad are divorced. And so she's watching Forrest Gump, and the scene in Forrest Gump, which intimates that the lead younger character, Jenny, was abused by her father, gives her the courage to tell her mom. And she does. And then that leads them to contacting the police. They start an investigation, but they don't know anything about the child sexual abuse material that's been made of her. So they're just, this is a allegation of hands-on sexual abuse that had been going on for years, had already stopped, but now, there's no physical evidence of it. It's basically her word making the allegation. And so they go and talk to him. He denies it all, but he knows that those videos are out there, and he knows it's only a matter of time. He is now, the clock is ticking down. And so he decides to flee the country. And he flees to Canada and eventually to mainland China. Because he knew that if he's caught, he's going to prison for life. And so he ends up going to mainland China, and he had a forged passport, the whole thing. Now, he was a former police officer, reserve deputy, sheriff. He was a tactical team member at the Hanford nuclear site in Washington, and so he had weapons training. He was a big, massive guy, bodybuilder, all these things, smart guy. And so he knew that what he was doing, that someday he might have to just pick up a bag and go. So he, like kind of out of the movies, had 2 forged passports, money, the whole bit in a bag. Had even told one of his colleagues about that, not why he had it, but that he had a bug out bag. And so he did it. He grabbed the bug out bag. He flew from SeaTac to Toronto, and he flew from Toronto to overseas, and then eventually to mainland China. And so the cops are like, it's kind of stalled. Well, then she had gotten a hand-me-down computer from him, and the family starts looking at that and actually finds a couple of the videos of her, goes back to the police, said, you guys need to search this computer. It was a hand-me-down from him to her, and there's stuff on it, and it proves that he did it. And so, because at this time, they still didn't really have enough to, and so now they've got enough to charge him. They indict him, and because he had fled overseas, they get the U.S. Marshals involved, which is how they end up on America's Most Wanted. And so now all the puzzle pieces are coming together like this. So now we, HSI, we need to prove some things because she did not live in the Portland, Oregon area. It was a trip, and the most significant federal crime relating to child exploitation is transportation of a minor across state lines, is what it boils down to engage in what's called illicit sexual conduct. And the fact that he then produced material, and so that's like a 30-year mandatory minimum sentence. That's where we're starting at. And I think the maximum was life. And so, and we had numerous counts. There were multiple counts of different charges related to child exploitation. So his exposure was definitely life in prison. And so a task force was formed to find him. Meanwhile, we're putting the whole case together. And one of the things we have to do is show that the hotel that this happened in, that one video was in, we need to find it to show. And so we break up into teams, and we look at every hotel in the greater Portland area. We're going to each hotel, and all we had was an interior shot of the room. And one of our investigators, one of our agents calls Josh and I and says, hey, I think I got it. I just interviewed this lady. She said, but they tore the hotel down. Yeah. So we go there, and literally I take this picture that it's just a pile of rubble. They're still cleaning it up. But fortunately, Josh was able to get with the property management company, and through the property management company, we're able to show they had insurance photos of the rooms, and then we were able to do a comparison to show that they were the same place. So now we have our venue, we got that location, we indict for the bigger charges, and so now it's really exposed. It takes, if my recollection's right, about another year and a half to get him back into back into U.S. custody, and it's a long journey to do that. Some of the things about this case that it completely changed. It's the reason I'm sitting here right now. It completely changed my life because I had a huge light bulb moment here, and I was like, man, we're doing all these cases, but we're not looking for victims. We're just looking for, well, how many images and videos does this person have on their drive so we can then charge the right things, and did they receive or did they distribute, so we can charge the right crimes, but we're not thinking about the victims at all. And I, from that experience, having interacted with her and interacted with her mom, was very impacted by that. And I was like, man, we got to change the way that we do this. We got to start wading into this data and not just using the technology that we're using now that will never find anything new. It's very good at finding data that is criminal, but it is not going to find anything new. And so that's a little bit more of a manual process. And so I created a workflow and started using some technology to do that. And I pulled 3 cases out of the evidence room that had already been done and dusted, no evidence of new victims was found, but we hadn't looked for it either. And I applied the new workflow to these 3 older cases. And sure as shit, I find 5 victims that I had shoved in the evidence room. And it was like, I'm feeling it right now, actually. It was like a punch in the stomach, but I'm elated at the same time because it worked. But I was like, how many kids have I personally shoved in, locked away in the evidence room? And I know I'm doing it. And I know all the other HSI agents that are doing this are doing the same thing. And I know globally, it's pretty much doing the same thing. So kids around the globe we have this opportunity, but we're not looking at the data the right way, and we're missing the opportunity, and kids are suffering because of it. Because if you think about it, and I can tell you from like actual life, true experience, a lot of these kids, people think about when they hear a news story, it's child pornography, or I think the public thinks it's like it's a 13, 14, 15-year-old in their underwear. It's not what we're talking about. Not even close. We're talking about rape of young toddlers. I mean, I've had multiple cases involving infants. It's some of the worst, most horrific abuse you could ever imagine. And most people, it's a protective measure, I think. I think our brains, I'm soccer mom at home and I really love my kids, and so your brain's not going to go to a place where that's even a possibility. And so when you hear the term, you just want to minimize that. Your brain does it subconsciously, and so your brain doesn't go to the worst case scenario. It goes to like what you can tolerate. And the problem with that is it means that we as a society, as a government, don't give this crime type the attention that it deserves. And so, and just to give you a kind of a comparison of that, right? Like, if you ask somebody, like, how do we know what the U.S. government cares about, right? You think, well, what does the U.S. government care about? Well, the best metric for that is how much money we put to a problem. If there's a problem, and we're going to show how much we care about that problem, we're trying to solve that problem, well, it's very commensurate with the budget that goes to that problem, right? It makes sense. So, drugs is a major issue. And we've been in the war on drugs for 50-some years. And we put 50-some trillion, something close to $50 trillion into that, right? Just in last year, the U.S. government spent $43 billion in the counter-drug program. $43 billion. But what the U.S. government puts to this problem, it's about $200 million. It is a order of magnitude different, and it's shameful. It's absolutely shameful that we as the United States government barely put any resources toward this problem. And there's this government program called the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, which most people will not have heard of. It's called ICAC. And it's incredibly important. It's incredibly important. And the ICACs are part of a budgetary line item in the U.S. government called the Missing and Exploited Children Budget, what we call the MEC budget. And the Missing and Exploited Children budget funds 3 things. It funds Amber Alert program nationwide. It funds the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is a nonprofit organization that receives some federal funding because they do some federally mandated things. And what that is they're the national clearinghouse for child exploitation. So when internet service providers find that kind of material on their networks, they're required to send it to them as a cyber tip. Now, one of the problems, none of them are required to look for it. So they only look for it if they want to, or if a member of the public comes in and points it out on their network, they have to report it. So several internet service providers don't even look for the material, even though it's likely on the network. Apple is a good example. Apple does not scan their network for this material, yet we know that this material is transmitted on Apple devices, on Apple services, commensurate with the population density of users. Meanwhile, Meta does scrape and they send in millions of cyber tips, and it's almost the opposite problem because they over-report a little bit. So the last thing that budget, that MEC budget supports is the Internet Crimes Against Children national program. And there are 61 ICACs across the country that cover every inch of the United States. But the whole budget for that whole entire MEC budget has traditionally, for the last few years, been $105 million. It's nothing. In the scheme of the U.S. government, it is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of government spending. Yet, it is the only program out there in the state and local law enforcement jurisdictions that's doing this work. And they're way under-resourced. They're way underfunded. They're way under just supported in general. And so that $103 million, the ICAC program gets $48 million of it on average. But then there are national pieces that have to get taken out. So when you filter it all down, the 61 ICACs split about $32 million. It's roughly $500,000 a task force. It doesn't, the amount of people that need to be working this, the amount of what we need to be doing in this space, it doesn't even come close. So one of the stats, I looked it up this morning, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, I told you the national clearinghouse for this material. It's about to cross 450 million images and videos of child sexual exploitation received to them from law enforcement seizures and mainly internet service providers. 450 million images and videos of kids being exploited and raped, from infants all the way up to teenagers. And in my experience, the vast majority, like the highest volume of that material that depicts an adult abusing a child are It's toddlers. And so we're not getting to this problem. I mean, we're pushing a boulder uphill. So then you have the federal agencies, you got HSI and you got the FBI, the only real two other agencies that do this work. And we're the same way. We're a little bit better funded, but we're still under-resourced, we're still under-supported. And the world at large does not understand the problem. It's one of the biggest issues we have. So educating the public is so incredibly important. And so when I'm looking at these 5 victims that I shoved into the evidence room and how do we scale this out? So I start doing that work. I start doing the work and we start rescuing more victims. Then I do a presentation. I put together a presentation. I speak at a major national conference called the Dallas Crimes Against Children Conference. And one of our bosses happens to be there from our central headquarters unit at a place called the Cyber Crime Center. And he sees me and he comes up to me afterward and he said, "Hey, this is awesome. The work you're doing, Interpol's starting to do some of this work and some other agencies overseas, but no law enforcement's doing this in the US. NCMEC is doing it. They stood up a new program to do this, but they're not law enforcement. It's a different angle." And he said, "I need you to come back to headquarters, to the Cyber Crime Center, start this program nationally." I said, "Whew, I got 2 kids in high school. And I'm not going to rip them out of school in their junior and senior year and have them come back to the Washington, D.C. area where they know nobody and start over again." And he said, "That's fair." He said, when does your youngest graduate high school? So, well, probably, I don't know the exact date, but I mean like May of 2010. And he says, okay. He says, in May of 2010, you're coming back to headquarters after she graduates. Now, this is 2 years away. And I said, okay. Like I didn't think much about it, but. And so I go about doing my work and getting engaged in these cases and teaching some others locally how to do this. And then lo and behold, in May of 2010, he calls me. And his name is Matt Dunn. He says, your daughter graduating high school this month? I said, yeah, she is. He says, all right. He says, well, I'm putting your name in whether you like it or not. He said, we need this back here. We need somebody to run it. We need someone, who understands it to come back here and start this up. And so that's what happens. I go back to headquarters and I start and found what's called the Victim Identification Program and Laboratory. And it starts, laboratory is a bit of a misnomer at the time because I was in a closet. I'm in a little tiny closet and I got monitors around me. And I start rescuing kids. And I start working with an international community, and at this time, the dark net is starting to explode. And, a lot of people won't have any experience with the dark net, but basically it's a government built and funded with private funding, anonymized network. So it makes it very difficult to find the users on the darknet. And there are people put up what's called hidden services. And these are basically websites that look like bulletin boards, forums for people to communicate. You can post imagery in them and do things. There's nowhere to serve a search warrant or a subpoena to, because everything about them is obfuscated, so you cannot track it and trace it. And so it starts to explode, and this Danish investigator and I, Mons Nielsen, he would get up in the morning, he's, 6 hours ahead of me. So he's coming in the morning, and he's starting to work on the darknet cases that have come up and popped up. And he's putting all that together. He's putting it into this international system that Interpol manages called ICSA, International Child Sexual Exploitation Database. And then he's saying, at Jim, I think this was in the United States. And then I'm coming in at 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm logging into that system, and I'm pulling everything that Matt found 5-6 hours ahead of me. And then I'm starting to work it up. And that relationship there leads us to basically identify and rescue 52 kids in the first 6 months. And one of those cases, which was called Operation Sunflowers, where it ends up being named, ends up getting national news attention. It was a race to rescue a child before she could be significantly abused. But what we had was an offender who went on to this darknet site and said, hey, I want to abuse this girl. How do I get away with it? And he was posting some imagery. It was real dark and grainy, and it looked like him masturbating over the top of a sleeping child. And offenders started giving him all kinds of horrible advice. Like, go get this drug, you can get her drunk, you can do that, you can have a friend hold her down, you can hold her down. There were a few that said, don't do it. Especially don't do it in a violent way. Others were groom her over time, and all that. And so we get this information and we start looking, and one of the pictures that he sends, because the offenders, they want the close-up dark images, it's not enough for them. They want to see her face. They want to see, what does she look like? Is she pretty? All these things. And so eventually he starts posting these non-abuse images. And he posts an image that looks like it was taken from the front passenger seat of an SUV or van. And she's sitting in the back seat to the left. And he takes the picture like this, and at the time that he took the picture, out the window, they just happened to be passing a state highway road sign with the number of the highway and the directional indicator on top in white. But because it wasn't the focus of the picture, it was very blurry. And so that image comes in, and I start working that image, and I am trying to figure out what state is this in and what is this number. And so as we start, and I'm like literally, I'm a good friend of mine is a guy named John Penn, who Adobe, they call him the Angel of Adobe. And he helps work this crime type with us through using Adobe tools. So I contact John, and they're happen to be working on a filter, which then I would become involved with in helping to develop the interface to, that he thought could help. He said, let us get you this kind of beta alpha of this filter and see if it'll work. And so we did it, and I'm able to make out that the first number is a 2. And that it's a sunflower, hence Operation Sunflower. Well, in the United States, the state of Kansas is the only state that has a sunflower as the state highway sign. And so it looks like Highway 203. At the end, we actually deployed a Highway 203, and we don't find anything else. There was a hay bale, there's a tree, there's a hedgerow, and there's a utility pole, and there's a hay bale. One of the round hay bales at the base of the pole. And so we go to Highway 203, it's not it. So like, all right, we're back to the hotel scenario again. So we're gonna basically team up with the Kansas Highway Patrol, other agencies, and we're gonna basically go 2 out, and we're just gonna drive every highway in the state of Kansas that begins with a 2. Oh, the other thing is I knew it said east. So we're gonna drive every highway in the state of Kansas that begins with a 2 and is an east-west running highway. And we're just gonna, I did the best resolution pictures I could of the hay bale and the utility pole and what it looked like. We handed them out in this big briefing, and then we assigned all the highways, and everybody deployed, and they just started driving these highways, looking for this hay bale and this utility. And the first day, nothing. So the second day, we're in the briefing again, and I'm paired up with this agent from Kansas City who's now retired. And he and I, Jesse, we're going to go out and we get in the car, and now we're assigned a different area. And of course, we're getting a little farther away now. So we're now in eastern central Kansas. And we're driving, and just lo and behold, you couldn't make this up for a movie any better. We end up driving by this highway. And I remember we had passed earlier signs on the same highway, and it wasn't it, and it wasn't it. And then as we got to where it finally teed and dead-ended, as we were kind of coming up on it, I see the highway sign, and I'm like, oh, there's a hay bale. This could be it. And I'm getting excited. And so, slow down. We get up there, and it's it. It's like, no question in my mind, like everything matches. And I jump out of the car, and I'm so laser focused on this thing, I'm not paying attention to the traffic on the highway. And he stops, I jump out of the car, and I run around the front, and I'm about to cross the street, and I almost get hit by a car. They're honking, and I'm like, oh, shit. Okay. And I got my camera out, and I'm taking pictures with my phone of it. I'm like, we got it. So we had some other imagery from the series of her in like a kitchen environment and at a pool, like a community pool. And we had tried to find that community pool from like Google Earth. I couldn't find it. And so we went to the local law enforcement. We said, do you know this girl? Do you know this pool? He's like, yep, that's right up the road. He's like, you need to go talk to the sheriff's office. It's in the next county up there. So we zoom up there. We find, and he's like, and here's where the pool's at. So we go to the pool first. It's definitely the pool. Take pictures of it. Now, of course, all the pictures we have were in summer, but now it's winter. So, there's no leaves on the trees. It's different, but it's all it. Go to the sheriff's office. They took one look at the picture that finally depicted her face, and they were like, yeah, we know that family. We've fathers in prison for methamphetamine, da 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 da. And so we end up going out there and doing a search warrant. From the time that we got that lead to the time that we interjected and got to that location and quote unquote rescued her was 9 days. And it was intense. Like because we were watching this offender post in the group, and he had access to her, post in the group more and more and more aggressive behavior, but he hadn't carried out anything that she would be aware of yet. He hadn't gotten to that tipping point, but you watch this progression of every day, the images he was posting and the things he were doing were getting bolder and bolder and bolder. And he lived in the same home with her. And when we contacted the family, and the mom was like, yeah, when she sleeps, she's dead. It's like she's dead. She's like, I can't get her up to go to school in the morning because she's just out of it. And it's like waking her up. And so she was kind of like, it would be easy to do something to her while she's asleep, and she wouldn't even know. And so in that 9-day period, though, we were able to intervene before anything, bad things had happened, but intervene before anything really, really, before she was physically and maybe brutally raped. And so that case ends up spurring news media, which spurs our director level management attention. And so next thing I know, I'm briefing our director of the agency on that case because he's going to go on a national news. It's never us do the case. Like the director's going to go on and talk about the case. And so my job is to get him all the talking points and show him a PowerPoint of that case so that he's prepared to do so. So he comes out to Cybercrime Center. We show that. I do the PowerPoint, and I'm in a room of my entire chain of command, right? Like at the time, I'm what's called a program manager, and the steps between me to get to the director, it's like this, like program manager, section chief to unit chief to deputy assistant director to assistant director to deputy director to director. And so he's there, and he's watching it, and he turns, and then his chief of staff kind of comes over and he says, "Hey, sir, your next meeting's been canceled, so we're not in a hurry." He turns to me and he says, "Well, Jim, that was fantastic." He's like, "What else you got?" I said, "Well, sir, we're, as an agency, this crime type, we're doing it all wrong." And I thought my deputy assistant director's head was about to pop off because I basically just told the director something negative, and you just don't do that. But that's not me. And so I'm just like, "Sir, we're not doing it right." And he's like, "What do you mean? Like, this was fantastic." I said, "Well, yeah, like this case is a great example of something we're doing right, but across the field, we're locking kids away in evidence rooms because we're too offender focused. How many victims, sir, have we identified and rescued in the last year as an agency?" He's like, "Well, shouldn't you guys know that? Like, that's your unit." I said, "We should, but we don't. I know how many I've rescued as part of this program because I keep a spreadsheet. But we have no way to track this in any of our systems. We have no way to do, and so, but isn't that the more important issue here? Is it really how many people we throw in jail, or is it how many lives that we can impact and because we're leaving these kids out there to receive no services? To still, even though the offender gets removed, oftentimes that's removed for a short period of time. I know toddlers that we did cases and rescued whose parent then went and did 5 years in prison. And so if that kid's 4 or 5 years old, the kid's going to be 9 or 10 years old when they get out of prison, roughly. And the way our family court system works, are we under the impression that offender's never going to have contact with that kid again? No. Our courts believe that almost under any circumstances, families are better together and kids need fathers. I think kids do need fathers and parental role models, but sometimes they shouldn't. They absolutely should not be. And you have seen out of anybody, people in this chair who should never have been with the parents that they were with.
That's right.
And so, because it causes so much damage. And I think this podcast is a great example of the damage, because it gives people a voice to talk about that damage and the trauma and how it impacted their lives as a whole. And some great human beings were short-circuited because trauma is just, it's a short-circuiter. And so I grew up, like my growing up, I lived in my parents were amazing parents. They cared deeply. There was love in our house. And I never experienced what the kids that were, now intervening or safeguarding, or the people that you've talked to that have gone through such trauma. I never experienced that, right? So I can't relate from that level of personal experience, but God, I've seen it. I've seen it in the faces. I've seen it in the actions. You've seen it in the destruction of family units. And you see it in the destruction of selves, of people who go down destructive pathways because that's how they cope. And people look down at drug addicts and addicts in general, and I don't know what it's like to be that. I've never been an addict to anything from a substance standpoint, but it's easy to judge, right? It's easy for us to look at somebody, but what I've learned in this career is that addiction drives people to do things that they, if not under addiction, would never do, and would absolutely hate and abhor. But the addiction and what's going on with that chemical substance in their brain is forcing or leading or bringing them down this path that they do really, really horrible and destructive things. And so I would argue, we'll take it back a minute, we spent $43 billion on the counter-drug budget. And I testified in front of Congress in March 2024. And I testified to the House Judiciary Committee, and I brought that statistic up. And I argued with them that what we're doing in this fight, in this internet crimes against children, this child sexual exploitation fight, is absolutely connected to this. Give us $1 billion, just one, because the good that we could do with $1 billion would be life-changing.
It'd prevent most of the addiction stories.
Again, it's got to be used the right way. It's got to be right. It's got to be tailored. It's got to be very. It's got to be just specifically and targeted and ways to do it. But God, it would, if we could prevent. One of the things we don't do is we don't do child abuse prevention, right? There's all these campaigns, but don't do drugs and don't. But prevention is the true key to this problem, because we, in our world, people who watch this who are in law enforcement in our world are going to say, "Oh, this is an overused statement," but it's absolutely true. We will never arrest our way out of this problem. There aren't enough jail beds in the world, right, to lock up every sex offender. There just isn't. And so what we have to do is we have to drive home prevention. We've got to get out there and we've got to really just go for, how do we stop this from happening? How do we harden the target to make offenders less successful, if you will? How do we teach parents the skills that they need to parent? And how do we, when there are opportunities, because in most of these cases, there were multiple opportunities to intervene, and they were ignored, missed, or just blatantly, not acted upon. And we wait for tragedies before we intervene in families. But there are numerous points in almost all the journeys. I listened to Seth, and his podcast, and Lisa. Two that really struck a nerve with me, because I'm like they can, like, what we see is exactly what they experienced, and they articulated it so well in their episodes. And I remember thinking, like, God, how many ways the system failed them, right? How many ways adults in their lives failed them. And then the other thing that I saw, like the grooming behavior that they talk about is exactly, it's it. And people talk about grooming, and, interestingly enough, this idea of grooming behavior, I mean, it's mental manipulation, right? Psychological manipulation that offenders use. And what they do is most of the public thinks that the people who get manipulated are the victims, right? The ones who are abused. And that's true. They do. They're manipulated into that. Seth is a great example of that guy coming into his life and manipulating through the games, and then the slow, come sit on my lap, you're cold, and it would be, a lot of it's engineered for that to happen. That's grooming, right? And but what we miss and what we don't understand is that the real target of grooming are the adults that are around that, in that child's life, they're in that circle, that would protect the child if given the opportunity. Because if the offender is grooming right, when an allegation, if an allegation comes out, which is rare, right? The people you've talked to, like, very few tell. Most of them have not told law enforcement to this day. That's because right. They're afraid to, and I get it, right? The system doesn't make it easy. And so, and there's so much, the other thing is the offenders manipulate with shame and guilt. They make them feel responsible for the actions of the offender. And so, but these offenders are grooming the adults. So if an allegation does come out, their first reaction is disbelief, because they've been groomed to believe that this is a wonderful human being and they would never do such a thing, and all these things. And I've seen it over and over and over again. And so we have to educate the general population on what that looks like, what grooming behavior looks like, what, oftentimes you think, oh, this person's this way. Well, sometimes things are too good to be true. And so it's critically important. And I'm going to take it back to the budget just for one more minute, because we could talk all day. I got case after case and huge cases and global cases, but I retired from HSI in 2023. After I was an agent in Portland, Oregon. I was first a program manager and then promoted to be a supervisor over the Victim ID lab. It grew the lab in both capability, footprint, and people. Now I think it's 7 people back there. Started as me in a closet. I was trying to start like a child exploitation task force, trying to get our law enforcement to work together on this fight kind of seamlessly and be co-located and work kind of as a regional unit, which I had seen work so well in Oregon, Central Oregon. And the problem was these agencies don't have enough funding. I go to these agencies and say, hey, if you give us a detective to do this work, we'll collaborate, we'll all do this work together. So I get every agency, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 agencies to give detectives. Then you've got our agents. We become a really solid task force, and we can, force multiply each other and rescue more kids. At the end of the day, what we want to do is rescue more kids. I would go to these departments, I talk to these investigations division commanders and chiefs of police, and they'd be like, man, I love the idea, but I don't have a person to give you, because, I've got X amount of detectives. It depends on the size of the agency, but they're all slammed. They're all doing 40 things. And if I peel one out to do just this, 1 or 2 things, who does the other 38 that they were doing? I can't take it and lump them on the other because they're already underwater. It was that same story over and over and over again. And then I was introduced to a guy who had a personal family tragedy related to trafficking. and he had started a nonprofit. And his problem was he didn't know exactly what the mission would be. He was an Army Special Forces guy, and so his idea behind it all was like, well, we'll engage in these military kind of things, and then we'll bring the cases to you. And most of those things were illegal, and to do it in the United States. Now you're overseas; there's different authorities, but here you can't do a lot of the things he was saying that they would do. Because we have this document called the Constitution, for number one, and so I said, hey, I can't do that. Like, you're going to end up in jail. Like, if you do that, where are we going to be putting handcuffs on you? And he was kind of stunned for me. He said, well, you're the expert. You tell me. What do I do? I said, well, I'm having this issue. I described it to him. I said, you said you can get funding. Local law enforcement can take some funding. How about we get funding to staff positions and the equipment and the software and the technology that they need to rescue more kids and private fund that? And he goes, I love it. Let's do that. And so we started the first Intercept Task Force, or Interagency Child Exploitation and Persons Trafficking Task Force in Nashville. And then quickly got buy-in from the Tim Tebow Foundation and started one in Jacksonville, and then shortly after that in South Florida. Now we have 5 task forces, about to launch our 6th in Alabama, that's doing exactly that. They're collaborating, working shoulder to shoulder to rescue kids. And so that's what we do at Operation Lightshine. And so I testified to Congress, and I said, one of the things I told them is, I said, we should not have to exist. If you think about the concept of a nonprofit organization fundraising for private funding, to fund a government entity to do what ought to be a government function, and it is a government function that's happening, but having to be subsidized by a nonprofit. Why can't we get the funding to do this job? What is going on? And so, but that's what we do. We rely heavily on public funding to fund law enforcement and give them the tools. And these are not people that are out doing narcotics. They're not doing any of the other things that law enforcement does. They are solely dedicated at these task forces to rescue kids from child exploitation and trafficking, and that's it. That's all we fund. We don't fund anything else.
What about putting away the predators?
Yeah, it's all part of it.
It's part of it.
That's all part, because here's one thing I kind of forgot to say. Is one thing I noted in testing out my theory on that workflow and all that was, if we focus on offenders and just arresting, we miss victims. But if we focus on the victims, we find more offenders.
That's right.
Right? Yep. That's how it works. And so, look, I'd say we can't arrest our way out of this problem. And that's absolutely true. But there are definitely there are some people that should not be walking out in the public, right? That are a danger to kids. Very quickly, one of the cases I had involved a grandfather who was horrifically raping his infant grandson. And when he was caught, when we worked that case through, and when he was caught and he went to court, he pled guilty, and he told the judge, he said, you got to lock me up forever, because if I get released, I will do it again. And so those people are out there, and I have stared evil right in the face. I have sat down and stared evil right in the face, true evil. But I also think there's a lot of these folks that end up going down that path that, had there been some intervention early, would never have gotten there. And so, but it's still important to have law enforcement out there doing that job, arresting the offenders and rescuing the kids. But we also have to put a lot of emphasis on that prevention and education.
What a great thing you're doing.
I don't know how to do anything else.
Yeah, this is what the world needs.
It's one of the things.
Yeah, but I think it would really put a big dent in the addiction stories, because if you listen to the videos on my channel, they all stem from this. Most of them.
Adverse childhood experiences
Yeah.
is it's called, and sometimes it's physical abuse, right? It's not always sexual abuse, but just like mistreating children in general just ends up badly for everybody.
Yeah. All right, Jim. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
When I was designing the first Softwood Underbelly book, I realized that there were so many great portraits that weren't going to make it into that book. They just wouldn't fit. And once I saw how well that first book sold, I knew I'd have to design a second book. This second book is finally ready to ship. Like the first one, this book has a collection of some of the best portraits from Soft White Underbelly, accompanied by a quote from that person's interview. This book features another group of Rebecca portraits, as well as a collection of color images of the Whitaker family, and plenty of others. You can order yours for $125 or $150 for a signed copy at softwhiteunderbelly.org. Again, like the first book, once this book is sold out, I will not be printing more of them. The portraits are what Soft White Underbelly is all about, and these two books contain the best of all that work. Thank you for watching. Is finally ready to ship. Like the first one, this book has a collection of some of the best portraits from Soft White Underbelly, accompanied by a quote from that person's interview. This book features another group of Rebecca portraits, as well as a collection of color images of the Whitaker family, and plenty of others. You can order yours for $125 or $150 for a signed copy at softwhiteunderbelly.org. Again, like the first book, once this book is sold out, I will not be printing more of them. The portraits are what Soft White Underbelly is all about, and these two books contain the best of all that work. Thank you for watching.